He had exactly 10 minutes. 10 minutes before the ministry arrived to find the one frame of film, a mere 24th of a second, that would either save his life or end it. He'd spliced thousands of reels in his career, but tonight his hands were shaking. What he'd found was a secret pulled straight from the throat of the Cold War, a conspiracy so deep that even the KGB didn't know its true dimensions. The names have been changed, but the code is real. And the men coming to collect that film, they were very, very real.
Let us go back to a city that no longer exists, in a country that dissolved like sugar in rain, to a morning in the autumn of 1961, when the world was holding its breath and a man named Viktor Sorokin was holding a broom. Moscow in October of 1961 was not the Moscow of the tourist brochures that the Soviet Information Bureau printed for foreign delegations. It was not the broad Stalinist boulevards photographed from flattering angles, not the chandeliered magnificence of the metro stations that the state trotted out as proof that socialism was beautiful and inevitable. The real Moscow of October 1961 was gray in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. It was gray the way a long illness is gray. A persistent, low-grade, atmospheric grayness that had been settling into the bones of the city since at least 1937, and perhaps much earlier, since the revolution had eaten its own children, and the children of those children, and was now, in its fourth decade, beginning to look around for anyone left. The streets smelled of coal smoke and diesel, and beneath that, the particular fermented odor of collective apartment buildings, boiled cabbage, wet wool, and the sharp ammonia of shared bathrooms, and something else, something harder to name, something like anxiety distilled into architecture. The October air had a bite to it that Muscovites described with a specific word, "kolodishche," a cold that does not just chill you, but insults you, that makes you feel personally selected for discomfort. The trees along Gorky Street had surrendered their leaves, and those leaves now lay in black, sodden mats against the curbs, trampled by the boots of workers heading to factories and offices in the pre-dawn dark. Viktor Sorokin walked these streets every morning at 5:30. He walked them in the dark because the cinema where he worked, the Rodina, the Motherland, every building in Moscow seemed to carry a name that felt like an obligation, did not begin its morning screenings until 9 o'clock. But the booth needed to be prepared, the reels needed to be checked, the arc lamp needed to be tested, and these were tasks that Viktor took seriously, in a way that other men might take their family or their ideology seriously. The booth was his. He was 34 years old. He was not tall, not short, not particularly handsome, not notably plain. He had the kind of face that surveillance photographers hate, the kind that does not anchor itself to memory, that slides away from recollection like a name you almost know. His hair was dark, going to gray at the temples, combed flat with a parting so precise it seemed architectural. He wore the same thing every day, a dark blue coverall over a gray shirt, both always clean, because Viktor Sorokin believed that a man who worked with precision instruments should dress as though he respected them. His hands were his most distinguishing feature. They were a craftsman's hands, a surgeon's hands in another life. Long-fingered, always slightly warm from the heat of the booth, the cuticles perpetually edged with a thin, dark line of machine oil that no amount of soap entirely removed. The oil was not dirt. It was, as Viktor privately understood, evidence. He carried in the left breast pocket of his coverall a small penknife with a bone handle, given to him by his father. He carried, in his right front pocket, a soft cloth for lens cleaning, folded precisely into quarters. And he carried, around his neck on a thin leather cord, a small brass gauge, a millimeter rule, calibrated for 35mm film stock, that he had machined himself at a technical college in Sverdlovsk in 1945, when he was 18 years old and the war had just ended and the future felt, briefly and improbably, like something worth calibrating for. These are the details that matter. Hold on to them. They will come back to you. To understand what Viktor Sorokin found that October evening, you must understand what Viktor Sorokin came from.
And to understand that, you must understand a particular kind of Soviet childhood. The kind that shapes a man not through trauma or triumph, but through the slow, patient erosion of alternatives. Viktor was born in Sverdlovsk in 1927, the only child of Alexei Sorokin, who repaired clocks, and Nadezhda Sorokina, née Volkova, who had trained as a schoolteacher but spent most of Viktor's childhood working as a bookkeeper for a textile factory collective. They lived in 2 rooms of a communal apartment on Ulitsa Lenina that they shared with 3 other families. 7 adults, 4 children, 1 bathroom, 1 kitchen, 1 telephone in the hallway that belonged, theoretically, to everyone, and practically to the family who held the most seniority in the building's party committee. Viktor's father, Alexei, was a careful man. This is the most important thing to understand about him. He was careful in the way that men who live under systems of comprehensive surveillance learn to be careful, with a carefulness that is not timidity, but strategy, a constant low-level auditing of every word and gesture against the question, could this be misread? Alexei Sorokin had watched 2 of his friends arrested in 1937 during the Great Purge, one of whom he never heard from again, and one of whom returned in 1943 with his fingernails grown back in a different shape and never once spoke of where he had been. Alexei had learned from this. He spoke at dinner about clocks and gears and the merits of different lubricating oils. He spoke about football occasionally, and about the weather, and about the price of bread. He did not speak about politics, the war, the collective, or the telephone in the hallway. He taught his son, by example rather than instruction, the survival technique of the Soviet citizen. See everything, say nothing. Trust the evidence of your own hands. This last phrase Viktor remembered hearing explicitly once, when he was perhaps 11 years old, and had come home distressed because a teacher had accused him of cheating on an arithmetic test. He had not cheated. He had, in fact, solved the problem in a different way than the teacher expected, using a geometric intuition rather than the prescribed algebraic method, and the teacher had taken this deviation as evidence of misconduct. Viktor had been furious in the private way children are furious when injustice comes wrapped in institutional authority. His father had listened to the whole story without expression. Then he had said, "Trust the evidence of your own hands, Vitya. Your hands solved that problem. The teacher cannot take that away from you by calling it something else." This is where Viktor Sorokin's relationship with craft began. Not with cinema, not yet. With the idea that technical truth is a form of protection, that what you can demonstrate with your hands cannot be argued away by anyone with a title. The cinema came later, and it came the way most important things come in the lives of people who do not have money, accidentally, and through someone else's problem. In 1944, when Viktor was 17,
His father's workshop took on a contract to service the mechanical components of the projection equipment at the October Cinema in Sverdlovsk. The workshop, which normally dealt only with domestic clocks and small machine parts, had expanded into whatever technical work the wartime economy would permit. Viktor accompanied his father to the cinema on weekends to help carry tools. And on one of those weekends, the cinema's chief projectionist, a man named Gavrila Tarasovich Bulanov, who was 63 years old and missing the first two fingers of his left hand from a pre-revolutionary industrial accident, noticed that Viktor could not stop looking at the projectors. These were Miopta machines, Czech-built, 35 millimeters, with carbon arc lamps housed in cast-iron lantern assemblies that radiated heat like small suns. They stood on their pedestals like mechanical priests, and when Bulanov, noticing Viktor's attention, switched one on for demonstration purposes, and the beam of concentrated white light cut through the darkness of the empty booth and struck the silver screen below, Viktor felt something that he would spend the rest of his life describing to himself, but never successfully communicate to another human being. It was not wonder, exactly, though wonder was part of it. It was recognition. The feeling of meeting something that had been waiting for you. Bulanov, who had no sons, and whose wife had died in the winter of 1941, began teaching Viktor to run the projection GK on weekends. By 1945, when the war ended and Viktor graduated from the technical college where he had machined his brass gauge, Bulanov GK had already spoken to the cinema management. Viktor Sorokin became a junior projectionist at the October Cinema in Sverdlovsk at 18 years old, and GK the next 7 years learning from Bulanov everything there was to know about the marriage between light and film. What Bulanov taught him was, at its core, a philosophy of GK. The projectionist, Bulanov explained once, is the most important person in the cinema who is never seen. He sits above the audience, separated from them by 50 feet of air and the thickness of a porthole glass, and everything they feel, every laugh, every tear, every moment of terror or joy, passes through his hands first. The film does not show itself, it is shown. The difference between a story that breathes and a story that merely moves on screen is the projectionist, the steadiness of his gait, the purity of his focus, the precise management of his arc lamp. The arc lamp. Let us stop here, because the arc lamp is the key to everything that follows. A carbon arc lamp works on a principle of almost violent simplicity. 2 carbon rods, positive and negative, are brought together until the gap between them is small enough for an electrical arc to jump across. The arc burns at temperatures between 3 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. It produces a light so white, so intense, so pure in its spectrum, that it approaches the quality of sunlight. The carbon rods burn as it operates, consuming themselves in the service of illumination. The projectionist must constantly advance the positive rod to maintain the precise gap, typically between 3 and 4 millimeters, that keeps the arc burning steady. Too wide a gap, and the arc flickers or dies. Too narrow, and the carbons fuse, and the whole assembly must be restarted. It is continuous, manual, attentive work, the feeding of a small, contained fire. Bulanov taught Viktor to read the arc the way a pilot reads the horizon, constantly, peripherally, without direct staring at the source, because you could lose your vision to it if you were careless, using the quality of the projected beam as your instrument. A good arc has a particular blue-white color and a steady, low hiss that Bulanov described as the sound of the picture thinking. A bad arc yellows and buzzes, and makes the shadows on screen look like old bruises. Viktor became, by all professional assessments, an exceptionally good projectionist. He moved to Moscow in 1952, the last year of Stalin's life, and joined the staff of the Rodina Cinema on the recommendation of a colleague who had seen him work and recognized in him the particular combination of technical mastery and monastic patience that the job demands. At the Rodina, he ran 2 projectors in alternating relay, standard practice, since a full-length film is distributed across multiple reels that must be swapped mid-screening with no perceptible break in the narrative, for 9 years without a major incident. His life in Moscow was quiet.
He had an apartment, genuinely his own, a privilege he had accumulated through years of model worker commendations. 1 room, kitchen, bathroom, in a 5-story Khrushchev-era concrete block in the Sokol district that the residents called the Khrushchevka, because Khrushchev had promised them they would be temporary in 1957, and 4 years later everyone understood that in the Soviet Union, temporary means permanent, and permanent means until further notice. He owned a radio. He owned a small library of technical manuals. He owned, inexplicably, a cactus on the windowsill that had somehow survived 8 Moscow winters through what he privately believed was sheer contrary stubbornness, a quality he found admirable. He had, at various points in his adult life, attempted relationships with women, 2 of which became serious enough that he had imagined futures, and both of which had ended in the slow, polite way that relationships end when one person's emotional availability is structured around a machine rather than another human being. He was not unhappy. He was, more precisely, complete in a way that excluded certain varieties of joy. He had, since childhood, the habit of noticing things that others do not notice. This is, in people of a certain temperament, less a gift than a condition. He noticed the pattern of wear on the Rodina's lobby floor tiles that mapped exactly the paths that audiences took most frequently, forming a ghost of the crowd's desire in polished stone. He noticed that the second projectionist, a young man named Fedya, who played chess and was frightened of his mother-in-law, always ate his lunch at exactly 12:43 rather than 1 o'clock, because his mother-in-law telephoned the booth at 1 o'clock and he did not want to be reachable. He noticed that the cinema's party liaison, a round-faced, sweating man named Comrade Zhavorenkov, always sat in the center of the 4th row during propaganda screenings and always shifted to the left in his seat precisely when he was about to ask a question, like a pitcher winding up. He noticed, in short, the small mechanical truths of the world around him, the tolerances and misalignments and rhythms that most people walk past without registering. And it was this habit, this lifelong calibration of attention, that made Viktor Sorokin the only person in the Rodina Cinema on the evening of October 17, 1961, who noticed what was hidden in Reel 3 of the Novosti Dnya newsreel. October 17, 1961, a Tuesday. Viktor remembered it beginning normally. He remembered the way the Sokol metro smelled that morning, the particular alchemy of electrical ozone and wet overcoats, and the Swedish industrial cleaner they used on the platform floors, a smell that to this day, if it could be reconstructed, would take him instantly back to the specific texture of that morning's ordinary dread. He remembered the sound of the escalator, a rhythmic, metallic click that always reminded him of the threading mechanism on the Miapta, the same patient, metronomic advance. At the Rodina, he climbed the back stairs to the projection suite. He always used the back stairs, a habit of professional discretion the projectionist does not parade through the lobby, and began his morning preparation. The preparation was a ritual,
and like all rituals, it was performed not by the conscious mind, but by the accumulated muscle memory of a decade, leaving the conscious mind free to observe. He checked the arc lamp carbons first. Each carbon rod, the positive, thicker, and the negative, thinner, with a specific ratio of copper core to carbon jacket that determined the quality of the arc, needed to be inspected and measured. He used his brass gauge, the one he had made at 17, and confirmed that the positive carbon had approximately 4 hours of burn time left, which was sufficient for the morning's scheduled screenings. He marked the measurement in his logbook. He opened the carbon storage cabinet and selected 2 backup rods, measuring them as well, recording their specifications alongside the date and the real numbers they would be used for. This was not required by the cinema's management. It was required by Viktor Sorokin. He threaded the morning's feature, a Soviet-Hungarian co-production about collective farm workers that had been playing to declining audiences for 3 weeks, and then turned his attention to the daily newsreel package. The Novosti Dня, or News of the Day, was a staple of Soviet cinema programming throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Every screening was preceded by a newsreel, typically running between 10 and 15 minutes, produced by the Central Studio for Documentary Films and distributed by the state film agency, Soyuz Kino. The content was, in the formal sense, news. The party congress was meeting. A new tractor factory had achieved its quota. Comrade Khrushchev had visited somewhere and been photographed shaking a hand. In the actual sense, the newsreels were a form of atmospheric maintenance, a regular calibration of the audience's relationship to reality. They did not inform, they confirmed. They were the sound of the party clearing its throat. For Viktor, the newsreels were a technical challenge distinct from feature films. They arrived on single reels, shorter in format, often assembled from multiple sources with varying exposure levels and different camera stocks, which meant that the arc lamp intensity required careful monitoring to compensate for the shifts in film density. A newsreel reel could move from exterior footage, shot in bright Caucasian sunlight, to interior footage, shot in a poorly lit factory, and the projectionist had to manage the throw of the lamp to keep the image consistently readable across these transitions. It was, Viktor considered, like conducting a small orchestra of one. The Novosti Dnya package for October 17th had arrived the previous afternoon, as scheduled, in its sealed metal canister from the Soyuz Kino distribution depot at Mosfilm. The canister was sealed with a paper stamp bearing the depot's official mark. Viktor broke the stamp, logging the break time, as per protocol, and removed the 3 reels within. He checked the leader frames, the blank footage at the head and tail of each reel that provides threading guides and run-in footage for the projectionist, verified the frame count numbers against the accompanying paperwork, and loaded reel 1 onto the left projector for the first morning screening. Nothing at this point felt different. This is the nature of certain kinds of revelation. They look identical to ordinary days until the moment they do not. It was during the second afternoon screening, the 3 o'clock show, running through reel 3 of the newsreel package, that Viktor Sorokin first saw the anomaly. Reel 3 of the package covered, as he recalled in his written account 3 decades later, a report on the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which had opened that very day. The footage showed the interior of the Kremlin Palace of Congresses, opened only that year, the largest building within the Kremlin walls, all glass and white marble, a Soviet aspiration made architectural, and Khrushchev at the podium, and the delegates in their ranked seats, applauding with the sustained, rhythmic, slightly mechanical applause of people who understand that applause is both sincere and required simultaneously. Viktor was at his standard observation post, standing behind the projector, one eye to the porthole glass that looked down on the auditorium, one hand resting lightly on the arc lamp advance wheel, attending to the beam without staring into it. The image on screen was stable. The arc was burning clean and blue-white. The gate, the aperture through which each frame of film is held and projected, was clear. Everything was as it should be. And then he saw it. Or rather, he saw something that triggered the visual alarm system of a man who has spent 16 years looking at film with the specific, analytical attention of a craftsman rather than an audience member. It lasted less than a frame. It may, in fact, have lasted exactly one frame, which at a projection speed of 24 frames per second amounts to 41 milliseconds, a duration so brief that the human eye cannot consciously register it. The eye registers it. The brain does not. The image is processed below the threshold of awareness, incorporated into the visual field without rising to recognition. This is, in fact, the basis of the technique. The average human brain simply absorbs the flash and files it in the large, unnamed drawer labeled film artifacts or projection noise. Viktor's brain was not average in this specific respect. Viktor's brain, shaped by 16 years of professional visual calibration, had developed its own internal standard for what constituted normal film behavior and what constituted deviation. And in the fraction of a second between frame 24 and frame 26 of a specific sequence in Reel 3, a cut from a wide shot of the Congress Hall to a close shot of the podium, Viktor Sorokin's nervous system registered a deviation. He did not stop the projector. You do not stop a projector in the middle of a screening. You do not stop it, and you do not telegraph that anything is wrong. Not at the Rodina Cinema, not in 1961, not under any circumstances that do not involve the building catching fire. He filed the sensation in the same drawer where he kept everything that required later attention: the jammed carbon rod from last Thursday, the flutter in the gate mechanism on the right projector, the particular sourness in the smell of the third-row ventilation that might indicate a cleaning issue. He filed it, and he continued to work. But the sensation did not stay filed. By the end of the 3 o'clock screening, it had promoted itself. He ran the 4 o'clock screening, and the 6:30, and the 9 o'clock. And each time Reel 3 cycled through the projector, his eye arrived at that same cut, the wide hall to the closed podium, running time approximately 4 minutes and 17 seconds into the reel, with a tightening of attention that was entirely professional and entirely involuntary, like a tongue returning to a loose tooth. The 4th time it passed through the gate, during the 9 o'clock screening, he was ready. He had positioned himself differently, closer to the projector, head angled so that his peripheral vision encompassed not the screen below, but the gate itself, the lit window through which the film traveled. And as the cut approached, he watched the film, not the image. And he saw it. Frame 25. The technique had a name in certain circles, though Viktor did not know the name then and would not learn it for another 30 years. In the propaganda and intelligence literature of the mid-20th century, it was sometimes called sverbystry kadr in Russian, the super-fast frame, or more technically, single-frame subliminal insertion, and its alleged applications ranged from behavioral advertising — the technique had been controversially claimed by an American market researcher named James Vickery in 1957, who said he had used it in a New Jersey cinema to increase Coca-Cola sales, a claim he later partially retracted — to military psychological operations to, in the intelligence community's quiet vocabulary, dormant asset activation. The theory was straightforward. The human conscious mind processes visual information at a rate that corresponds, roughly, to standard film projection speeds. Below approximately 12 frames per second, motion appears to the eye as separate images. Above 12, and increasingly as you approach the 24 frames per second of standard cinema projection, the images fuse into the perception of continuous motion. The critical point is this: the eye continues to receive every frame. The brain chooses which frames to consciously process. By inserting a single frame containing information into an otherwise normal sequence, you could, theoretically, deliver that information to the viewer's eye, and through the eye, to the subconscious processing layers of the brain, without the conscious mind ever registering that it had received it. If the viewer had been conditioned in advance to respond to the subconscious stimulus, if they had been, in the language of intelligence operations, prepared, the single frame could serve as a signal, a trigger, a message. Not a message read and understood, but a message received, the way a radio antenna receives a signal without the radio itself being aware of anything. Victor did not know all of this on the evening of October 17th. What he knew was what his hands and his eyes told him, which was this. In Reel 3 of the Novosti Dnya newsreel package, between frames 24 and 26 of a specific cut in the Congress footage, there was a frame that did not belong. Its emulsion density was slightly different from the surrounding frames, a detail invisible to any eye not specifically trained to read film stock consistency. Its visual content, which he could not make out at projection speed, was not consistent with the surrounding footage, and it had been placed there deliberately. The splice work on either side of it was perfect. Perfect in the way that only very experienced hands make perfect, but it was still a splice. Viktor Sorokin had made 10,000 splices in his career. He knew a splice the way a carpenter knows a joint, and the joint on either side of frame 25 was not original to the reel. It had been inserted carefully and recently into a government-produced and government-distributed newsreel that was at that moment playing simultaneously in hundreds of cinemas across the Soviet Union. He ran the 9 o'clock screening to its conclusion. He rewound the reels in their correct order. He logged the screenings in the booth register with the same precise handwriting he always used. He set the arc carbons to standby. He did all of this in the specific, deliberate way of a man who knows that the walls of a building are not merely walls. Then he sat down on the stool he kept in the corner of the booth and pressed his palms flat against his thighs to stop them from shaking. The question that sat down beside him on that stool was not, "What is this?" Victor's professional mind had already, in the way of minds trained to diagnose rather than speculate, reached a conclusion about what it was. The conclusion did not comfort him. The question that sat beside him was, what do I do with knowing this? In the Soviet Union of 1961, this question had a structure that civilians of other times and places have difficulty understanding. It was not simply a moral question, a calculus of right and wrong. It was a survival question, a calculation of probability and consequence across multiple possible futures, none of which were safe, and some of which led to outcomes that Viktor Sorokin had spent his adult life avoiding thinking about too directly. Option 1. He reported what he had found to the cinema's management, who would report it to the party liaison, Comrade Zavorenkov, who would report it to his superiors, who would report it to the appropriate department. This was the prescribed behavior. It was also the most dangerous, because reporting implied knowledge, and knowledge, in the Soviet security apparatus's understanding of human motivation, implied involvement. The man who found the body is always the first suspect. If Viktor reported the frame, he would be questioned about when he first noticed it, how many times the reel had been screened before he reported it, whether he had made copies, whether he knew what the frame contained. The questions themselves were the mechanism. By the time they finished asking questions, the answers were less important than the shape of the anxiety produced by the questions. Option 2. He said nothing. He ran the reels as scheduled for tomorrow's screenings and continued to say nothing, and let the men from the ministry collect the film at the scheduled time, which was 11 o'clock tonight. He had been informed of this collection by a memo from the Soyuz Kino Depot, standard procedure after a Congress-related newsreel run, and pretend that he had noticed nothing at all. This was also dangerous, because if the frame was subsequently found by someone else, another projectionist at another cinema, a Soyuz Kino editor reviewing prints, a technical inspector, and it was established that the Rodina's reels had been among the screened prints, then Viktor's failure to report would retroactively become concealment. And concealment, in the Soviet legal vocabulary, was a form of participation. Option 3. There was a third option, and it was the one that his hands had already begun to lean toward without consulting the rest of him, because his hands were, as his father had taught him, the most honest part of his body. He could cut the frame out. If he cut frame 25 out of reel 3 before the ministry collection, the frame would cease to exist in the official print. There would be, after the cut, a marginally shorter sequence, 1 frame shorter, 41 milliseconds shorter, that no one watching a screened print would ever detect. The splice would be invisible to any eye less trained than his own. The frame would be gone. Whatever it contained would be gone. And Viktor Sorokin could, with some truthfulness, tell himself that he had done neither harm nor service to anyone, that he had simply corrected an anomaly in a film print, which was, after all, his job. The problem with this option was that he did not know what the frame contained. He did not know whether cutting it was the act of a brave man or a catastrophically naive one. He did not know who had put it there or who it was meant for. He did not know if the men from the ministry were coming to collect the film because they had already found the frame and were tracking its chain of custody. He did not know if cutting it would protect him or sentence him. What he knew was this: the frame was there. It should not be there. And in 9 years of running the Rodina's projectors, he had never once passed a damaged print to an outgoing transfer without correcting the damage first. It was, he told a journalist in 1999, in the only interview he ever gave on the subject, a very simple decision. And then, after a pause long enough that the journalist began to wonder if he had fallen asleep, or it seemed simple. Perhaps that is what courage is. Simplicity in a moment that is not simple. He checked the clock on the booth wall. It was 10:37. The collection was scheduled for 11. He had 23 minutes. He unlocked the reel canister and removed reel 3. A film splicer is a device of elegant mechanical brutality. The one Viktor used was a Soviet-manufactured model, the KS-3, a cast aluminum table-mounted unit approximately the size of a large dictionary. It operated on the butt splice principle. 2 pieces of film are brought together end to end, a single frame is removed from between them, and a narrow strip of adhesive transparent tape is pressed across the join on both the emulsion and base sides of the film, bonding the cut ends into a continuous strand. When done correctly, when the cuts are made in the precise center of the frame-to-frame sprocket hole, when the tape is applied without air bubbles or wrinkle, when the emulsion surface is clean, a butt splice is essentially invisible in projection. The image jumps forward by one frame.
The eye does not notice. Viktor had performed this operation so many times that his body could begin it before his mind had fully committed to it. He threaded the film onto the viewer attached to the splicer, a small backlit screen that allowed him to view individual frames in magnification. He cranked the film forward by hand, watching the frames advance on the viewer, and found the cut. He saw it for the first time fully. And here, in his 1999 account, he paused again, for a long time. Long enough that the journalist asked him, quietly, if he needed water. What he had seen, magnified on the viewer screen of the KS3 splicer in the projection booth of the Rodina Cinema on the evening of October 17, 1961, was text. Cyrillic text, dense and small, laid over a background that was neither the Congress Hall footage that preceded it, nor the Congress Hall footage that followed it, but what appeared to be a gray field, almost neutral, almost a piece of unexposed film. The text was in columns. Viktor's account, made from memory across a gap of 4 decades, was necessarily imprecise about the specific content, but he noted several things. There were what appeared to be dates, in a format he recognized as consistent with Soviet administrative dating conventions. There were what appeared to be proper names, or numbers that might be names in code. And there was, at the bottom right of the frame, a small but recognizable mark, an organizational symbol of a kind he had seen only once before, on a document his father had been required to sign in 1939, when the NKVD had come to question him about a colleague and had never, as far as Viktor knew, pursued further. The mark was not the KGB. Or rather, it was not only the KGB. But Viktor Sorokin was not a spy, and he was not an analyst, and in the 67 seconds he allowed himself to study the frame, he could not extract its full meaning. What he could extract was enough. This was an instruction. This was a communication. And it had been traveling, in the guise of official state newsreel footage, through the projection systems of Soviet cinemas for at least 1 day and possibly longer, and no one had seen it, and no one would see it if he did his job, and in 15 minutes men from the ministry would arrive at the Rodina's service entrance and take the reels away, and the chain of communication would be complete. He thought about Bulanov, who had died in 1958 and who had never, in all his years of running projectors, encountered anything like this. He thought about his father and the bone-handled penknife in his pocket. He thought about the cactus on his windowsill in Sokol and wondered, with the specific irrelevance of a mind trying to contain something too large, whether it would need watering before Thursday. Then he positioned the film in the splicer gate, aligned the frame markers with the cutting edge, and picked up the handle. The cut takes less than a second. You press the handle down, the blade, honed to a tolerance of 0.02 of a millimeter, drops through the film at the sprocket hole margin. The two ends are separated. Then you flip the splice guide, apply the tape, press the roller, and trim the excess. Viktor's hands moved through the sequence with the unhurried precision of a man doing a familiar thing, even though his mouth tasted like copper, and the back of his neck had produced a thin, cold sweat that was soaking into his collar. When it was done, he held the single excised frame up to the light of the arc lamp standby indicator, a much gentler light, amber rather than white.
and looked at it one more time. The text was too small to read at this magnification without the viewer. The image was the size of his thumbnail. He could make out the columns of characters, the specific shape of the mark at the bottom right, and nothing more. He had 4 options with the frame itself. He could destroy it. He could keep it. He could hide it. He could discard it in a way that made it findable. Viktor Sorokin was the son of a clockmaker who trusted the evidence of his hands. He was not a hero of the resistance. He was not a spy or a counter-spy or a man with a cause. He was a projectionist with a 16-year professional objection to damaged prints.
But he was also, underneath the coverall and the precision and the careful calibration, a man who understood that certain pieces of evidence, once destroyed, become the thing that can destroy you. Certain frames, once burned, leave an ash that testifies to what they contained. He folded the frame twice along the natural grain of the celluloid, which resists folding but yields to patience. He folded it until it was a small, hard square, approximately the size of a postage stamp. He placed it inside the soft lens cloth that lived in his right front pocket, beneath the cloth's top fold, where it settled invisibly against the fabric. Then he replaced Reel 3 in its canister, resealed the package with fresh packing tape — the broken depot stamp was already logged and unremarkable — and placed it on the transfer shelf beside the booth door. At 11 o'clock and 4 minutes, there was a knock at the booth door. He had expected ministry. He had built an image of ministry in his mind during the 4 minutes between replacing the canister and the knock. Gray suits, possibly uniforms, the specific face of official authority that the Soviet state had, over 40 years, refined into something almost architectural, a kind of mobile bureaucratic granite. He had prepared his face. He had practiced, in the silence of the booth, the expression of a man whose evening had been completely ordinary. The door opened. There were 2 of them. The first was young, 26 or 27, with a kind of face that looked like it had been ironed flat. No distinguishing features, no expression worth reading. He wore a dark overcoat that was slightly too large for him, and carried a document folder that he held with both hands as though it contained something that might escape. The second man was older, perhaps 50, with a gray mustache and the slow-moving confidence of a man who has never, in his adult life, been required to hurry. He was wearing a suit rather than an overcoat, and his suit was good in the specific way that Soviet suits are occasionally good, not in fabric or cut, but in the authority of the man inside it. The older man looked around the booth with the thorough, unhurried scan of someone who is reading a room rather than seeing it. His eyes moved across the projectors, the arc lamp assemblies, the reel canisters on their labeled shelves, the logbook open on the counter, Viktor's brass gauge on its leather cord, and finally, Viktor himself. "Projectionist Sorokin?" His voice was conversational, not warm, but conversational. "Yes." Viktor's voice was level. He was proud of how level it was. "You've had 3 public screenings today, all 3 reels." It was not a question. 4, Viktor said. The 3 o'clock, the 4 o'clock, the 6:30, and the 9 o'clock. It's logged. He indicated the logbook without touching it. The older man nodded slowly. "Any incidents? Technical issues? Equipment irregularities?" This was the sentence he had prepared for. He had prepared for it the way a musician prepares for a difficult passage, in advance, in detail, without drama. The arc gap required adjustment at approximately the 5-minute mark of reel 2 during the 6:30 screening. Standard carbon burn compensation. I logged it.
The older man looked at the logbook. His eyes moved down the entries. He did not touch the logbook either. The print quality. Anything to note? Viktor looked at him steadily. The negative contrast on the Congress interior footage was slightly high, overexposed original stock. I compensated with gate adjustment. It's standard for the studio's interior newsreel work. Nothing unusual.
The young man with the overcoat had moved, during this exchange, to the transfer shelf and was lifting the reel canisters. He was inspecting the tape seals. Viktor watched him do this and felt, in the muscles of his jaw, a tension that he controlled by counting internally the specific number of seconds between his heartbeats. 6 seconds. 5. Back to 6. The young man placed the canisters in a document bag and sealed it with a metal closure. The older man had continued looking at Viktor. He had, Viktor noticed, the very specific quality of attention that men develop when their profession is the detection of lying. Not aggressive, not obviously searching, but absolutely present, absolutely focused on the space between what you say and what your body says simultaneously. "Long day," the older man said finally. "They're all long," Viktor said. The older man smiled, just barely, just enough to acknowledge the sentiment without endorsing it. Then he turned and followed the young man out the booth door. The young man, already halfway down the hallway, did not look back. Viktor Sorokin did not move for approximately 2 minutes after the door closed. He stood in the center of the booth between the two projectors, his hands at his sides, and listened to the sound of the building settling around the recently vacated presence of official authority. Then he picked up the logbook. He added one final entry for the evening. Transfer to Soyuz Kino Collection, 2304. Reels 1, 2, 3. Condition: screened, rewound, intact. He signed it with his standard signature, which was illegible in a specific way that was entirely his own. In his pocket, the folded frame of celluloid pressed against the warmth of his thigh like a small and patient secret. He did not sleep that night. This is not unusual in accounts of people who have done what Viktor Sorokin had done, and it is important not to romanticize it. He did not lie awake staring at the ceiling in cinematic anguish. He lay in the dark of his single room in Sokol and went through the evening with the systematic attention of a technician reviewing a procedure, looking for errors, looking for the moment he might have been seen or recorded or miscalculated. He reviewed it twice, then 3 times. By the 4th review, he had reached the clockmaker's conclusion. The work was sound. The join was clean. There was nothing in the evidence to indicate that the splice had been detected. What remained was the frame in his pocket. In daylight, on the kitchen table, he unfolded it with the lens cloth spread beneath it to protect the emulsion surface. He held his desk lamp over it, a 60-watt bulb in a metal shade, inadequate but workable, and looked at it with a magnifying glass he used for checking splice work. The text was Cyrillic. The columns, he could now see more clearly, were arranged in what appeared to be a data format. Identifiers in the left column, 2 letter codes or abbreviations in the center column, and what appeared to be date and time combinations in the right column. There were, he counted, 14 rows of data. The organizational mark in the bottom right corner was rendered in a style he now recognized, in the cold, clear light of an October morning, as consistent not with KGB or MVD symbology, but with something older, something that predated the current state security architecture, something that would have been familiar to a man who had been young during a different government's tenure. Viktor Sorokin was not a spy. He could not decode what he was looking at.
But he was a systematic man, and so he did what a systematic man does with evidence he cannot interpret. He documented it. He had in his technical library a small camera, a Zorky 4, used for photographing equipment specifications and serial numbers. He used it to photograph the frame, the full frame, and then selected sections at higher magnification, using the desk lamp as his light source. He used one roll of 12 exposures, a full roll, enough to capture every detail his eye could resolve. Then he refolded the frame and placed it, with the roll of film, inside the cover of a technical manual, The Mechanical Maintenance of Soviet Projection Equipment, Volume 2, 1958 edition, that he had been meaning to repair for several years because the binding had come loose and several pages were detached. He pressed the frame flat between pages 84 and 85, which dealt with the lubrication of gate mechanisms, and re-glued the binding with the cold process adhesive he kept for equipment maintenance. He placed the manual back on his shelf between Volume 1 and a Hungarian translation of a film developing handbook, and went to make tea. He worked at the Rodina Cinema for another 6 weeks without any further contact from the ministry. The Novosti Dnya packages came and went in their standard rotation, unremarkable, unmodified. He watched each one with the professional attention he had always brought and found nothing in them that did not belong. By December, he had begun to construct a private theory, not complete, not fully articulable, but coherent in its structure, about what the frame had been, who had placed it there, and, most unnerving of all, why a frame carrying activation instructions for dormant intelligence assets had been embedded in a Congress newsreel at precisely the moment when the Party Congress was adopting a resolution, as it in fact did, on October 17, 1961, the last day Viktor Sorokin might consider himself an ordinary man, de-Stalinizing the party structure, removing Stalin's body from the Lenin mausoleum, and in doing so, reorganizing the entire internal architecture of Soviet power. Someone, Viktor had come to believe, had used the most ordinary instrument of state communication, the mandatory cinema newsreel, the film that ran before every feature in every cinema in the Soviet Union, the film that the audience half-watched before settling in for entertainment, to send a message at a moment when the power structure was reshuffling, when the loyalties of certain embedded operatives might be unclear, when certain dormant assets might need to know which way to lean. And in all the cinemas across the Soviet Union where that Novosti Dnya package had played, in all the projection booths staffed by men and women who sat above their audiences and managed light and carbon and the rotation of reels, not one person, not one, had noticed what Viktor Sorokin had noticed. Except he understood with a cold that had nothing to do with the Moscow winter. Whoever had placed the frame there must have known that projectionist attention was the only real vulnerability in the delivery system. They must have known that the probability of a projectionist with the specific combination of professional training and analytical temperament to detect the anomaly was vanishingly small. They must have, in other words, assessed the risk as acceptable. The question, then, that Viktor Sorokin spent the next decade living with in the specific, private, unshared way of a man who cannot tell anyone what he is living with, was this: had they been right? The answer came, as many answers in intelligence history come, from a direction and a timing so counterintuitive that it seems, in retrospect, almost designed to be misread. In 1973, Viktor Sorokin was transferred, at his own request, to the Technical Maintenance Division of the Soyuz Kino Distribution Depot at Mosfilm. He had spent 12 more years as a projectionist at the Rodina, 12 years of running arcs and splicing reels and logging carbon consumption with the same meticulous precision before applying for the transfer on the grounds of a knee condition that made the booth's steep access stairs increasingly difficult. The transfer was approved. He became a film technician, responsible for inspecting and repairing prints before and after distribution. The work was familiar in its material but novel in its perspective. As a projectionist, Viktor had seen films from the transmission end. As a print technician, he saw them from the circulation end. He saw the same prints at multiple points in their lives, before distribution, after screenings, after recall. He saw what happened to film in transit, what kinds of damage occurred naturally, and what kinds of damage occurred otherwise. He developed, over the next several years, a new level of expertise in the reading of film as a physical object, rather than purely an optical one. In 1977, inspecting a batch of recalled newsreel prints from a provincial distribution cycle, Viktor Sorokin found a second modified frame. It was in a different position. Different reel, different newsreel series, different content. But the splice work was, in his professional judgment, and his professional judgment was now, after 32 years, something that operated at a level below conscious reasoning, the work of the same hands, the same technique, the same absolute precision of cut. This time, he had the equipment to look more carefully. He had access to the depot's optical analysis bench, an industrial device used for quality control that allowed frame-by-frame examination at high magnification under controlled lighting conditions. He requested a scheduled maintenance hour on the bench on a Wednesday afternoon when the depot was understaffed due to a party committee meeting that everyone was required to attend, and he was required to miss because of an urgent print correction. He looked at frame 25 of the second modified reel for 38 minutes. What he found confirmed his theory. And then it overturned it. The data structure was the same: identifiers, codes, dates. But the organizational mark in the corner was different. It was not the mark he had seen in 1961. It was a different symbol, one he did not recognize. But beside it, in a font so small it resolved only at maximum bench magnification, was a single additional character, a number, a year. And the year was not Soviet. He photographed the frame. He spent the following 3 weeks researching, in the publicly available literature of technical and military history, the organizational structures that used the mark he had found. It was slow work, conducted obliquely, through the kind of reading that can always be justified on technical grounds. By the end of the 3 weeks, he had arrived at a conclusion that sat in his chest like a stone. The frame was not Soviet intelligence, or it was not only Soviet intelligence. The organizational mark, cross-referenced against a detail in a technical history of the Warsaw Pact military communications systems that he had borrowed from the depot's reference library, and that was inexplicably accessible to anyone, corresponded to a structure that existed in parallel with, and in certain organizational dimensions beneath, the visible KGB architecture. A structure that had persisted, in modified form, across multiple reconfigurations of the state security apparatus. A structure that maintained, in the language of the technical literature, continuity of operational function independent of political directorial change. This was the language of intelligence permanence. This was the institutional vocabulary of a system designed to outlast governments. Viktor Sorokin, standing at an optical bench in a Mosfilm depot on a Wednesday afternoon in 1977, understood that what he had found in 1961 was not an operation. It was an infrastructure. The modified frames were not a one-time message deployment. They were a communications network, using the distribution of state cinema newsreels as a carrier wave that had been running invisibly through every cinema in the Soviet Union, possibly since before the projection booths were built.
And the people collecting the reels after screenings, the ministry collections, the depot recalls, the standard distribution cycling, were not collecting film. They were collecting messages. They were running a postal service inside the projector. He had not cut the operation in 1961. He had cut one letter from one mailbox in one city. The service had continued for, at minimum, 16 more years, probably longer. In 1977, Viktor Sorokin photographed the second frame, documented the analysis bench session in the depot maintenance log under a legitimate maintenance notation, returned the reel to the inspection queue, and went home. He made tea. He looked at the cactus, which was in its 29th Moscow winter and showed no signs of reconsidering its commitment to survival. He sat for a long time in the specific silence of a man revising his understanding of the size of what he is inside. Then he went to his bookshelf. He took down The Mechanical Maintenance of Soviet Projection Equipment, Volume 2, 1958 edition. He opened it to pages 84 and 85. The frame from 1961 was still there, pressed flat and precise, exactly where he had left it 16 years ago. He had, by this point, accumulated photographs of both frames. He had notes. He had a theory that had grown over 16 years from a single anomaly into something that described an architectural dimension of the Soviet surveillance state that no published source, as far as he could determine, had ever documented. He had, in other words, evidence of something that the people running it believed was invisible. A man with the evidence of his hands. The years between 1977 and 1991 are, in Viktor Sorokin's account, a period of watchful stillness. He continued his work at the Mosfilm depot. He looked at every print that passed through his inspection bench with the double attention of a man who has learned that film carries more than images. He found, in those 14 years, 3 more modified frames, 2 in newsreel packages, 1, and this was the one that most disturbed him, that sent him back to his kitchen table and his magnifying glass and his systematic documentation with a focus that was almost physically painful, in a children's educational film. A film about the Soviet space program shown in schools. He photographed them all. He documented them. He built, in the technical manual on his shelf, a small and meticulous archive. He told no one. This was not cowardice, or not only cowardice. It was the calibration of a man who understands that an unsupported claim against an invisible infrastructure is not evidence. It is noise. And Viktor Sorokin had spent 50 years distinguishing between signal and noise. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991, Viktor Sorokin was 64 years old. He retired from the Mosfilm depot. He collected his pension and his exit paperwork and his commendation for 20 years of technical service, and he carried them home in a plastic bag that also contained a desk photograph and a lens cloth. He retired on a Thursday. On Friday morning, he made tea and looked at the cactus and thought about what to do next. The answer, as it had always been for Viktor Sorokin, was in his hands. Over the following 8 years, he assembled his archive into a documented dossier, photographs, analysis notes,
cross-references to the historical record, a technical explanation of the insertion methodology, clear enough to be understood by anyone with a secondary education. He submitted the dossier, in 1999, to a journalist named Irina Semyonova, who wrote for a small historical review journal, and whose work he had read and judged, over time, to be honest in the specific way that technical reporting is honest, interested in the mechanism of things, not merely their drama. The story ran in 3 installments. It was not widely read. It was, however, read by the right people, specifically by 2 former KGB archival officers who had been working since 1993 on a separate project involving the KGB's operational history and who recognized, in Viktor Sorokin's technical description of the frame insertion method, a procedure they had encountered referenced in an archival notation from 1959 and had been unable to fully explain. They contacted Viktor. They spent 2 days in his apartment in Sokol. He made tea. They looked at the cactus, which was by now 42 years old and had achieved, in Viktor's estimation, the organizational permanence of a Soviet institution. They looked at his photographs and his notes, and the 2 frames still preserved in the technical manual, the 1961 frame and the 1977 frame, still flat and legible after 4 decades of pressed darkness. The archival officers were careful men, as archival officers tend to be. They reviewed the material twice. They took notes. They thanked Viktor Sorokin, and they went away, and they did not contact him again for 7 months. When they did contact him, it was by letter, in the formal style, and the letter said what Viktor had expected it to say, which was that the material was consistent with the documented history of a specific signals and communications subdirectorate of the Soviet state security apparatus that had been formally dissolved in 1989 and whose operational archive had been partially destroyed and partially absorbed into successor agencies during the 1991 transition. The letter did not say that Viktor Sorokin had been right. It said that his material was consistent with, in the language of archival officers, this is the same thing. The newsreel distribution network, as best as the archival investigation could reconstruct, had operated from approximately 1957 to 1988, using modified single-frame insertions in selected prints of the Novosti Dnya and related newsreel series to deliver operational instructions to a network of dormant assets embedded throughout the Soviet civilian infrastructure. The network had been established under a program whose name was redacted in the available documentation. The total number of modified frames distributed through the system was estimated conservatively at several hundred. The total number of assets who received and correctly processed the subliminal instructions was unknown. The total operational effect of the network was, in the archival officer's assessment, impossible to establish with existing documentation. There was one additional finding, one that the archival officers included in their letter not as a central fact, but as a footnote, which is often where the most important things live. In the Soyuz Kino Depot records for the distribution cycle of October 16th to 18th, 1961, there was an anomalous notation. The Rodina Cinema's print return for the Novosti Dnya package of that cycle had been flagged in the depot's incoming inspection log. The flag notation read, in the abbreviated system used by the depot's technical staff, "Splice anomaly, Reel 3, standard correction." It had been logged and cleared without further action. The depot inspector who cleared it was not identified by name, which meant that someone at the Soyuz Kino Depot in October 1961 had known that Viktor Sorokin had made a splice, had known, had flagged it, and had cleared it. Standard correction. The archival officers offered no interpretation of this. It was, they noted, consistent with multiple scenarios. It was consistent with the interpretation that the depot inspector had been part of the distribution network and had assessed Viktor's splice as a routine technical correction by an unusually attentive projectionist, a false positive from a professionally competent but operationally naive employee. It was also consistent with the interpretation that the inspector had known exactly what the splice meant and had made a deliberate choice to record it as ordinary, to clear the flag, to let the unremarkable entry sit in the archive for 40 years without consequence. Viktor Sorokin read this footnote several times. He thought about the older man who had come to collect the reels that night in 1961, the one with the gray mustache and the slow-moving confidence. He thought about the way that man had looked around the booth, and looked at the projectors, and looked at the arc lamp assemblies, and finally looked at Viktor himself. He thought about the quality of that attention, and the particular smile, just barely, just enough to acknowledge something without naming it. He thought about his father and the clockmaker's wisdom. Trust the evidence of your hands. And he thought, perhaps some of the people inside the machine were also trying to find the frame. Viktor Alexeyevich Sorokin died in Moscow in 2006 at 79 years old. He died on a Thursday in February, which was, depending on how you count these things, either ironic or appropriate. A Thursday, the same day of the week he had retired from the depot 15 years earlier, carrying his career home in a plastic bag. He died in his apartment in Sokol, in his sleep, which is the death that people who have lived carefully and privately tend to earn. The cactus on the windowsill was 59 years old. He left no family. He left his technical library and his documented archive, which had been partially photographed by the archival officers and partially retained by Irina Semyonova for a book she was writing that was never completed. He left, in the binding of the Mechanical Maintenance of Soviet Projection Equipment, Volume 2, 1958 edition, the two original frames, one from October 17, 1961, and one from 1977. Neither has been publicly exhibited. Both are, as of the last available reporting, held in a private collection in Moscow whose owner has not sought publicity. The Rodina Cinema closed in 1998. The building was converted to a commercial space. The projection booth, which was on the third floor and had no windows facing the street, was incorporated into a storage area. Viktor's logbook from his years at the Rodina, which he had, in a last act of professional diligence, requested from the cinema's management when it closed, on the grounds that it was a technical document, was donated after his death to the Russian State Archive for Art and Literature, where it sits in Box 4, Folder 7, of a collection catalogued under his name, accessible to researchers with the appropriate accreditation. The last entry in the logbook, made on December 31, 1972, his last night as a projectionist before the transfer to Mosfilm, reads, Arc carbon consumption, within parameters. Gate mechanism, clean. All reels transferred at close. Everything in order. Everything in order. The signature of a man who had spent his life insisting on this, and who had found, in a single frame between two ordinary frames in a government newsreel, a reminder that order is the most elaborate disguise that disorder wears, that inside every smooth rotation of a projector mechanism there are tolerances and clearances and gaps where the light does not reach, where the frame that should not exist can be slipped by careful hands into the sequence of the official story. The carbon arc lamp, the gate, the 24 frames per second, the one frame that is invisible because it is surrounded by the light of all the others. The projectionist sits above the audience, separated from them by 50 feet of air and the thickness of a porthole glass, and everything they feel passes through his hands first. Viktor Sorokin understood, from the day Bulanov showed him the projector's beam cutting through the darkness of an empty cinema, that the most important person in the room is the one nobody sees. He was right about more than he knew, and somewhere in the archive, in the light of a desk lamp and the evidence of a man's hands, frame 25 is still there, still waiting to be read. If you found this story, subscribe, not for the algorithm, for the Viktor Sorokins, the people in the booths above the audience, doing the work that holds the picture steady. The next film is already loaded. It's already running.